So back in 1930, there's this poet, Langston Hughes, and he looks at a 2-cent price increase on a bag of sugar at his local corner store.
Right. Just a tiny, boring, everyday detail.
Exactly. But he uses that mundane little detail to basically indict the entire racial and economic structure of the United States.
Mhm.
I mean, he didn't write a political manifesto or draft legislation. He just wrote a poem.
Yeah, and by doing that, he proved that poetry isn't just, some decorative art form that we analyze in dusty classrooms. It's really a weapon or a blueprint. And mostly it's a cultural memory bank.
It's the place where a nation literally argues with itself about what it means to even exist. Because, I mean, we often think of American history as this very neat, structured timeline, right? You have the Declaration of Independence, then the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution.
Right, it looks like the straight line of progress when you read it in a textbook.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
But when you actually read the poetry from those eras, that straight line just completely fractures into, like, 1,000 conflicting perspectives.
It really does, and that fracture is exactly what we are going deep into today.
Yes, welcome to this deep dive. And I want to speak directly to you listening to this right now, specifically you, the student tuning in from India, because I think this is super relevant to you.
Oh, absolutely. The parallels are huge.
Right, because when you look at your own country, you don't see just one single monolithic identity. You see this incredibly complex linguistic map, competing regional histories, centuries of colonial impact, and this constant tug-of-war between ancient traditions and hypermodernity.
Yeah, and the United States has its own messy version of that exact same struggle. So today we're exploring how American poetry basically acts as a battlefield. It's where the nation's identity, its relationship to the actual land, and its cultural memory are just constantly being fought over.
And rewritten over and over.
Exactly. And to navigate this battlefield, we're pulling from a very specific stack of sources. We'll be looking closely at Harold Bloom's modern critical views, Paul Zolbrod's really foundational text, reading The Voice about Native American oral poetry.
That one is fascinating, by the way.
It is. And we also have Charles Altieri's analysis of 20th-century poetics, along with some great insights from the best American poetry anthologies.
Okay, so our mission today is to use really simple, clear language to unpack how these American poets use words, forms, and imagery to wrestle with all this heavy stuff. But we're not just going to, list what these poets wrote.
No, we want to take the engine apart.
Okay, let's unpack this. We want to look at the mechanics. How does a single line break, or choosing to use an ancient poetic rhythm instead of modern slang, fundamentally change the whole political reality of a poem?
Right, like how does a poet handle that massive tension between their own isolated personal experience and the crushing weight of a whole national narrative?
It's a huge question. And to answer it, we actually have to step outside what we usually call literature. Like if we want to find the root of the American voice, starting with printed books from European settlers is just, well, it's the wrong starting point entirely.
It completely misses the mark. We have to examine the oral traditions that were here long, long before a printing press ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean.
Right, because America's first literature wasn't written down at all. It was spoken.
Yeah, according to Paul Zolbrod's text, Reading the Voice, in Native American cultures, like the Iroquois up in the Northeast or the Navajo in the Southwest, poetry and the sacred are completely inseparable.
He calls poetry in those societies a cultural institution, right?
He does. But we have to be careful with that word, institution, because when we hear that, we usually think of a physical building, like a museum or a university, something very static.
Yeah, something that doesn't change.
Right.
But oral poetry is the exact opposite of static.
Exactly. Zolbrod means it's a dynamic mechanism for social cohesion. Think about it. In a print culture, reading a poem is a private act. You sit alone in your room with a book. But in an oral culture, poetry is a public performance.
It's a community event.
Right. It's a vital tool used to align everyone's group morality, to remember their ancestors, and literally to negotiate their survival with the natural world around them.
Which I have to say is a striking parallel for anyone familiar with Indian oral traditions. I mean, for thousands of years, the Vedas were preserved strictly through oral recitation. But there is a really distinct difference in the mechanics here that I want to highlight.
Oh, definitely. The transmission methods are totally different.
Right, because passing down the Vedas relied on absolute, perfect phonetic accuracy, like down to the exact syllable and the exact pitch to maintain the religious power of the chant. But from what Zolbrod outlines, Native American oral poetry seems a lot more elastic.
Elastic is the perfect word for it. It's the defining feature of the living voice. Zolbrod points out that a Native American song or chant is meant to be heard over and over throughout a person's lifetime, and it actively adapts to the present moment.
So it changes depending on who is singing it.
Yeah, the performance shifts based on the specific speaker, the audience that day, the season. It's alive.
But then, of course, Western anthropologists and translators show up.
Right, and that's where the danger comes in. They take this dynamic, living performance, they transcribe it, translate it into English, and print it in a heavy book.
They freeze it.
Exactly. By freezing it on a silent page, they strip away all that performative magic. We end up having to, as Zolbrod titles his book, read the voice off a totally inert sheet of paper.
Which honestly feels like trying to study a bird by looking at a fossil.
Yeah.
You get the rough shape of it, but you completely use the flight.
Hmm.
So how does Zolbrod suggest we actually read these transcriptions without losing the magic?
Well, he creates a framework for us. He says we need to stop looking for Western poetic markers. So forget about rhyme schemes or, iambic pentameter.
Right, throw out the old British rules.
Yeah. Instead, focus on the text's voice, which can range from really lyrical to very colloquial, and its mode, which might be dramatic or narrative.
Okay, let's look at the lyrical voice, because that gets interesting. In Western print cultures, we usually think of lyrical poetry as this intense, private spilling of spontaneous feelings, like a diary entry.
But in Native American oral poetry, the lyrical voice relies on tightly patterned, heavily structured, almost hypnotic repetitions.
Give me a concrete example of that. What does that actually look like when we read it on the page?
Okay, Zolbrod examines this traditional quackyudal cradle song. Now, on the printed page, a direct transliteration of this song looks jarringly repetitive to a Western reader.
Because it just repeats the same sounds over and over.
Right. It uses a structural device called incremental repetition. The singer pairs specific, meaningful native words with repetitive vocables. Those are sounds like yahaha across multiple stanzas.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Because if a skeptical student is reading that in a textbook, they might say, well, that's just a really basic song. They're just repeating nonsense sounds because they don't have a complex vocabulary to express emotion. How is that a sophisticated poetic device?
That is such a common misconception, but you're basically judging the software of an oral culture using the hardware of a print culture.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Explain that.
In an oral society, that incremental repetition serves multiple vital functions. First off, it's an incredibly advanced mnemonic device. It's a memory tool.
Because they didn't have flashcards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It allows the singer to memorize massive, epic, hours-long narratives by anchoring them to a repetitive structural rhythm.
Okay, makes sense. And the second function?
Second, when performed live, those vocables aren't just filler, they establish a physical rhythm. It literally aligns the breathing and the heartbeat of the audience. The repetition creates a trance-like state.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's poetry functioning as an active spell to soothe the baby, sure, but also to align human biology with the larger rhythms of nature, like day and night, the tides, the changing seasons.
So it's about total integration with the environment rather than just standing back and observing it. And that actually ties directly into another source we're looking at today, George William Cronin's collection of Native American poetry.
Yes, the imagery in that collection is stunning.
There's this one song transcribed there called Early Moon. And the imagery completely shifts the way we, as modern readers, perceive the landscape. It describes the moon in the Indian West.
Let's quote a bit of it.
Yeah, it goes, the baby moon, a canoe, a silver papoose canoe, sails and sails in the Indian West. A ring of silver foxes, a mist of silver foxes, sit and sit around the Indian moon.
Notice the diction there, a mist of silver foxes. Think about what the landscape is actually doing in that imagery.
It's completely alive.
Yeah.
I mean, in Western poetry from the exact same era, the landscape is usually just a painted backdrop, right? A poet stands on a hill, looks at the moon, and basically projects their own sadness or joy onto it.
The landscape is passive for the Western poet.
Exactly. But in Early Moon, the natural environment is the active agent. The stars in the poem function as runners. The landscape is actively participating in the community's collective memory.
The text even calls these environmental elements the panel of memory, fire-white writing tonight of the red man's dreams.
Yeah, the land isn't just the setting where the story happens. The land is the text itself.
And that reveals a profound socio-political reality about pre-colonial America. In this worldview, there is no hard boundary between the human soul and the physical soil.
They're completely blended.
Completely. The sky, the floods, the animal life, these are the primary forces that register the human spirit. The sacred is not locked away inside a stone church. It's deeply embedded in the everyday dirt and trees.
But, and this is the big turning point, that deeply embedded organic connection to the land is exactly what gets violently severed.
Yes. Centuries later, everything changes.
We fast forward, and the American landscape undergoes one of the most rapid and violent transformations in human history. We go from a world where the moon is a silver papoose canoe to a landscape that is just dominated by steel mills, railroads, telegraph wires, and these massive, sprawling industrial cities.
The Industrial Revolution
Yeah.
and the socio-political upheaval that came with it completely fractured the American psyche.
Which brings us into the early 20th century, and this is where we look at Harold Bloom and Charles Altieri's analysis of the modernist movement.
Right, and according to the texts, the defining crisis for these modernist poets was just absolute alienation.
Yeah, because how do you write poetry in a world that's suddenly been mechanized, traumatized by World War I, and totally stripped of its ancient myths?
Their answer was pretty simple. You can't use the old tools anymore. Trying to capture the loud, blaring, chaotic reality of 1920s industrialized America using a polite 19th century British sonnet.
It's like trying to run modern software on a mechanical typewriter. Just
Yeah.
crashes.
Exactly. The old linguistic hardware physically could not process the speed and the violence of all these new inputs.
So the modernists felt this desperate need to break away from traditional British English. And from what I understand, there was actually a really fierce debate going on during this time, led by critics like H.L. Mencken, about whether there even was a legitimate American language.
Oh, European critics were brutal about it. They argued that Americans had basically just degraded and bastardized the King's English. It was viewed as improper.
But the modernist poets totally flipped that argument, right?
Yeah, they claimed the exact opposite. They argued that American speech, with all its slang, its immigrant influences, its fast-paced, choppy rhythms, it wasn't a counterfeit of British English. It was a completely new, vital stream of expression, and it demanded its own poetic form.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at how that actually played out on the ground with William Carlos Williams. Because if you want to talk about engaging with the raw reality of a physical place, Williams is the ultimate case study.
He really is. He wasn't sitting in some fancy expatriate cafe in Paris like Gertrude Stein or Ezra Pound.
No, he was a working pediatrician. He spent his entire adult life in these gritty, working-class industrial towns in New Jersey, literally delivering babies in the middle of the night, driving past factories and rail yards.
And Williams believed that the only way to tap into universal human truths was to look obsessively at the local reality right in front of you.
So he rejected all that European intellectualism. He didn't want to make fancy allusions to ancient Greek and Roman mythology.
Exactly. According to Altieri's analysis, Williams sought a new poetics of realism. He wanted to capture the exact, unpolished, warts-and-all rhythm of everyday American speech.
We see that perfectly in his book, Spring and All. There's a famous poem in that collection where Williams looks at the really devastating impact of industrialization on the everyday people living inside it. He writes, "The pure products of America go crazy."
Let's pause and really analyze that specific diction, the pure products of America. Why do you think he uses the word products to describe human beings?
Because it's an indictment of the capitalist machine. He is literally taking the language of the factory pure products, like a toaster coming off an assembly line, and he's applying it to the citizens.
Right. He's describing the people who have been left behind by the American dream.
Yeah, the poem goes on to describe mountain folk from Kentucky and the ribbed north end of Jersey, and he just lists off these isolate lakes, deaf mutes, thieves, promiscuity. It's a really harsh, unsparing look at societal degradation.
Yeah, and this is crucial for understanding Williams. He doesn't look at these marginalized figures with aristocratic disdain. He doesn't look down his nose at them.
No, he actually finds a stubborn, vital energy in all that brokenness. He's navigating the tension between this despoiled, ruined landscape and the sheer persistence of ordinary life. But I have to challenge Williams's approach for a second, because this is exactly where a lot of readers, myself included sometimes, hit a brick wall with modernist poetry.
Let's hear it.
Let's take his absolute most famous poem. It is literally 16 words long. It goes, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens."
Ah, yes. The red wheelbarrow.
To a skeptic, that isn't a poem. That's just a fragmented sentence about farm equipment. I mean, how did Williams convince the literary world that a random wheelbarrow was high art?
The genius isn't in the subject matter alone, it's in the mechanics of the form. Look at how he physically structures those 16 words on the printed page.
With the really weird line breaks.
Exactly. By using extreme, unnatural line breaks, like literally breaking the word wheelbarrow into wheel on one line and barrow on the next, breaking rainwater into rain and water.
Okay, what does that actually do?
It forces your eye to slow down dramatically. He is taking a dirty, ordinary agricultural tool and, through the sheer force of poetic structure, isolating it until it becomes hyper-real.
Oh, wow. So it's an exercise in attention. He's basically saying that in a modern world moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, poetry's job is to literally force you to stop and look at the physical reality right in front of your face.
Precisely. He takes the mundane and treats it with the same absolute reverence that a traditional British poet might treat a massive cathedral.
So he brings dignity to the harsh, local American reality.
He asserts that the imagination is the only force capable of clarifying the eternal moment in which we live. But, we have to note, Williams's collective, grounded realism is only half of the American modernist identity.
Right. To understand the other half, we have to look at his contemporary, Wallace Stevens. And Stevens is a massive pivot.
Total opposite end of this spectrum.
Yeah, if Williams is out in the muddy streets of New Jersey listening to the slang of his patients, Wallace Stevens is locked entirely inside his own mind.
Harold Bloom identifies this deeply ingrained native strain in American literature, which he actually traces back to the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's the strain of solipsism.
Okay, break that down for us. What is solipsism in this context?
It's the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. Bloom argues that in American poetics, there is this recurring sense that an American never feels truly free or truly themselves unless they are completely isolated in nature, totally alone.
And Wallace Stevens is the ultimate architect of that isolated intellectual sublimity. Let's dissect his masterwork, The Auroras of Autumn.
He wrote this late in life, right, at age 68.
Yeah. And the setting is deceptively simple. It's an aging man walking on a beach at night, looking up at the aurora borealis, the northern lights. But he isn't looking at them and thinking, wow, what a beautiful natural phenomenon.
No, he is experiencing something deeply, existentially terrifying.
He opens the poem by transforming the lights into an archaic cosmic terror. He writes, "This is where the serpent lives, the bodiless. His head is air. Beneath his tip at night, eyes open and fix on us in every sky."
The diction there, the serpent lives, the bodiless. He turns the shifting, harmless lights into a massive, indifferent cosmic predator.
But what really fascinates me is the landscape he is standing on while he's looking at this serpent. He doesn't describe the beach with the vivid, tactile realism of William Carlos Williams. He just describes the landscape as a blank.
And that word blank carries immense historical and literary weight. In his analysis, Bloom connects Stevens' use of the word blank directly to the classic poet John Milton.
Right, Milton, who famously lamented the universal blank of his own blindness in Paradise Lost.
Exactly. And Bloom also connects it back to Emerson, who wrote that any ruin or blank we see in nature is actually just a reflection of the ruin in our own eye.
Whoa, that is heavy. So when Stevens writes, "The man who is walking turns blankly on the sand," he observes how the north is always enlarging the change, with its frigid brilliances, the color of ice and fire and solitude. He isn't actually describing the beach at all.
No, he is describing the inside of his own mind. Stevens realizes that the sinister, terrifying blankness of the universe is a creation of his own imagination.
He's an aging man confronting his own mortality and the sublime indifference of the cosmos.
And in that massive, terrifying emptiness, the only way he can define his identity is through his own self-recognition. He literally creates the world by perceiving it.
Which sets up this incredible paradox at the very heart of modern American identity.
It's a huge tug of war.
Right. On one hand, you have the Williams approach, this desperate need to belong to a community, to capture the collective noise, to be firmly embedded in the local dirt. And on the other hand, you have the Stevens approach, this deep desire to be completely self-reliant, to stand totally alone against a blank universe and rely solely on your own intellect.
It's the constant tension between the collective we and the isolated I.
But we need to critically examine that blank landscape that Stevens was staring at, because as Charles Altieri in the Best American Poetry anthologies point out, the American landscape was never actually blank.
Never. It was deeply, violently stripped by history.
Yeah, the luxury of standing on a quiet beach and meditating on cosmic emptiness is exactly that, a luxury.
If you were on the wrong side of American history, you couldn't afford to ignore the socio-political realities of race, violence, and memory that were literally embedded in the soil.
This is a crucial pivot for our deep dive. Because while Wallace Stevens is engaging in high-level philosophical solipsism, Poets like Langston Hughes are dealing with the immediate visceral threat of physical violence.
Hughes took the realist poetics of the modernists, but he weaponized them. He infused his poetry with the rhythms, the syntax, and the heavy historical weight of African American music, specifically jazz and the blues.
To understand how Hughes navigates this, we have to do a close reading of his 1930 poem, Flight. And the sociopolitical context here is paramount.
Right, this is the post-emancipation period, but rituals of racial terror, specifically lynchings, were actively prevalent across the American South.
The poem is set in a swamp, and it details a black man attempting to escape from a lynch mob. And the imagery is just suffocating.
But what is so structurally brilliant about Flight is how Hughes positions the reader. He doesn't just tell you a story about someone running away.
He forces you into the physical mechanics of the escape. He describes the agonizing, almost impossible task of having to step through thick mud without leaving tracks for the hounds to follow.
The hounds in that poem function as a terrifying historical through line. They track the violence of chattel slavery directly into the present moment of 1930.
And by focusing so intensely on the sensory details of the mud in the pursuit, Hughes forces the reader to simultaneously occupy the position of the helpless observer and the terrified victim.
It is a masterclass in using poetic form to impart historical trauma. You physically cannot read that poem and maintain a safe, objective distance.
He strips away the luxury of looking away, and he does something equally sophisticated with everyday diction in another piece, Harlem 1.
Let's bring back the example you mentioned at the very beginning of the show about the price of sugar.
Yes. The poem starts by reflecting on systemic oppression, mentioning the old lies and the old kicks in the back. But then the poem's perspective fundamentally shifts. It moves from an isolated I experience to a massive collective voice.
The poem declares, "Sure, we remember. Now when the man at the corner store says sugar's gone up another 2 cents and bread 1, and there's a new tax on cigarettes, we remember the job we never had."
Let's break down how that mechanism works, especially for a listener tuning in from India who might be navigating their own complex economy right now.
It's a very relatable dynamic.
Think about how inflation or sudden taxes affect everyday people. When a government imposes a tax, the immediate reaction for a working-class citizen is localized economic pain. It's frustration at the checkout counter.
Right. But Hughes takes that mundane, everyday diction sugar going up 2 cents, and he transmutes it into a profound socio-political critique.
He is basically saying that this tiny economic pressure isn't just bad luck. It is a direct result of a rigged system. We remember the job we never had because we're colored.
According to our sources, this is the formation of a Marxist we in poetic form. Hughes is showing us that history isn't just a static list of dates in a textbook. It is a living, breathing force that dictates who gets to eat, who gets to work, and who suffers today.
The collective we in Harlem is bound together not just by living in the same neighborhood, but by the shared inherited memory of systemic, economic, and racial subjugation. He uses the simplest, most accessible language to map out an entire sociological reality.
And speaking of mapping out history, that brings us directly to Marianne Moore.
Yes. Now, her stylistic choices were radically different from Hughes. She was known for her incredibly dense, highly structured verse and her meticulous observations of animals and objects.
But despite their stylistic differences, she was equally obsessed with how Americans deliberately misremember their own past. She actively fought against the erasure of cultural memory.
She recognized a very specific American pathology, right? This tendency to take complex, violent historical sites and just flatten them into superficial, sanitized tourist attractions.
Exactly. In her poems, The Hero and Virginia Britannia, she demands that the reader look past the manicured lawns and confront the tangled, really dark roots beneath them.
Let's look at The Hero first. She constructs this brilliant juxtaposition. She introduces the character she calls the fearless sightseeing hobo.
Which is the quintessential modern tourist.
Right. They walk into a historic sacred space like a national cemetery, and they just want to check a box. They ask shallow questions like, where's Martha buried? They just want the easy, domesticated version of the Founding Fathers.
But structurally, Moore sidelines that tourist. The true hero of the poem is not the sightseer, and notably, it is not George Washington or any of the marble statues.
The hero is the unnamed, frock-coated Negro guide who works at the cemetery. This is where her critique is so sharp. The white tourist completely ignores the black guide, asking her white companion for directions instead.
But Moore points out that it is the guide, standing quietly in the shadows, who actually possesses a sense of human dignity and reverence for mystery.
Moore is explicitly stating that if you want to access the true cultural memory of America, you cannot look at the monuments built by the victors. You have to look at the marginalized figures who have been forced to tend the graves of that history.
She applies that same rigorous historical critique to the physical landscape itself in Virginia, Britannia.
That poem is set in Jamestown, right?
Yeah.
The site of the first permanent English settlement in the Americas.
Yes. And Moore observes how the colonizers arrived with an imperial motto, Vincere est vivere, which translates from Latin to conquer is to live.
To conquer is to live. That says it all right there.
It really does. They attempted to impose their absolute will on the environment. They planted neat English boxwoods and white roses, assuming natural dominion over the rugged terrain and the native inhabitants.
But Moore shows us that the landscape just refuses to be colonized so easily. The environment pushes back.
Lord.
The imperialist fantasy envisions a soft, warm Virginia breeze, but Moore describes the reality. It is sweltering, oppressive, and thick with the sounds of malarial insects.
She reveals that American history isn't a triumphant narrative of heroic conquest. It is a brutal story of starvation, subjugation, and what she brilliantly calls an inconsistent flower bed.
The identities of the colonizer and the colonized, the human and the landscape, become inextricably, violently entangled.
Through this really dense imagery, Moore subverts the arrogant myth of American dominion. History, in her poetics, is never a static monument. It is an ongoing, unresolved struggle.
Okay, so both Hughes and Moore prove that the actual content of poetry, like the stories told or the historical figures they chose to center, is a really powerful tool against cultural erasure.
Absolutely.
But this introduces a really fascinating architectural question for me. Hughes and Moore fought using the content of their poems. But what happens when poets use the actual structural rules of poetry to rebel?
Oh, this is a great pivot.
Like, how do you take the very shape of a stanza or the meter of a line and turn it into a political statement?
That is where the interplay between innovation and tradition becomes the actual battleground. In the landscape of American poetry, the form you choose is never neutral.
Choosing to write a rigid sonnet versus a free-flowing, punctuationless verse is a profound declaration of how you view authority.
And no poet manipulated this tension more subversively than Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Millay's strategy is absolutely wild when you place her in the context of the 1920s.
Because you have the male titans of modernism, T.S. Eliot, as Repound, and their whole ideology is that traditional poetic forms are dead.
Right. They are writing these highly fragmented experimental epics like The Wasteland that literally look like shattered glass scattered across the page. They believe the only way to reflect a broken modern world was to physically break the structure of the poem itself.
And then Millay comes along and does the exact opposite.
While the male modernists were fracturing language, Millay chose to write sonnets and ballads. These are highly structured, centuries-old, incredibly polite European forms.
But it would be a massive mistake to read her stylistic choice as conservative or antiquated. As critical analysis highlights, Millay utilized traditional form as a Trojan horse.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that. How exactly does a sonnet function as a Trojan horse?
Well, a sonnet carries a historical expectation of polite, refined, usually male-driven romantic yearning. It is structured in strict iambic pentameter, that da-deen, da-deem, da-deen rhythm.
Very predictable, very safe.
Very safe. Millay takes that culturally accepted, respectable architecture, and she uses it to smuggle in radical subversive themes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she writes openly about female sexual autonomy, about transient desire, about gender identity, and the commodification of women's bodies.
The cognitive dissonance for a 1920s reader must have been massive.
Huge. They are lulled into a false sense of security by the familiar ticking rhythm of the meter, only to be hit with an unapologetic assertion of female independence.
So she is essentially using the establishment's tools to dismantle the establishment's ideas. She proved that you don't have to literally shatter the structure of a poem to shatter the societal rules governing gender and power.
She challenged the male-dominated hierarchy of modernism by arguing that formal beauty could actually be deeply dangerous.
And if Millay was using old traditional forms to smuggle in new ideas, Hart Crane took the exact opposite approach.
Crane is a fascinating contrast. He attempted to invent a massive, entirely new epic form to tie a fractured country back together. Let's examine his magnum opus, The Bridge.
Crane's ambition here is just staggering. Because when you look at modern American history in the 20s, with the invention of subways, sprawling railroads, chaotic urban growth, it feels like a random, irreversible timeline of industrial
Here
facts.
is no overarching spiritual narrative to tie it all together.
Right, and Crane wanted to fix that. He wanted to take all that mechanical chaos and weave it into a unified, sacred pattern.
He was attempting to construct a modern mythology. To understand his method, we can look at the theories of the anthropologist Mircea Eliade, specifically the myth of eternal return.
What does that mean in this context?
Eliade argued that archaic human societies could not psychologically handle the terrifying randomness of linear history. To survive, they created rituals and myths that connected their present everyday actions back to a divine origin moment.
A cycle.
Exactly. And Crane believed that modern America was suffering because it lacked this sacred connection to its origins.
So his solution was to take the physical structures of industrial America and turn them into gods. He takes the Brooklyn Bridge, a literal masterpiece of steel and engineering, and elevates it into a spiritual symbol.
He tries to build a metaphorical bridge that connects the gritty reality of 1920s New York subways all the way back to the primeval sacred landscape of the Native Americans that we discussed at the very beginning of the show.
It's a heroic, almost desperate attempt to cure the American isolation that Wallace Stevens embraced. Crane wanted to build a cultural institution out of modern ink and steel, creating a shared national memory.
However, the critical consensus in our sources is often that the bridge, while brilliant, ultimately collapses under its own massive ambition.
Because you can't just forcefully manufacture a myth out of thin air and expect a diverse, divided country to universally adopt it.
Yeah, you can.
Which brings us perfectly to our final poet, Elizabeth Bishop. Because if Crane represents this desperate need to plant a flag and say this is the grand unified truth of America, Bishop represents an entirely different, highly skeptical approach to identity and place.
Bishop emerged a generation later, and her stylistic choices reflected deep, deep distrust of grand narratives.
She actively avoided the sweeping, authoritative I that defined earlier poets.
Right. Instead, Bishop adopted the persona of the traveler or the perpetual outsider. If a poet like Robert Lowell was agonizing over the question, who am I? What is my historical legacy? Bishop's poetry instead asks the spatial question, where am I standing?
Where am I standing? That is a massive philosophical shift. Instead of trying to dominate the landscape or claim ownership over a definitive American identity, she approaches the world simply as a tourist.
And mechanically, she achieves this through a poetics of hesitation. She uses constant revisions within her own lines. She uses dashes and question marks.
What does that do for the reader?
This stylistic choice fundamentally decenters the traditional dominant Western ego. By admitting that she is just a tourist, observing from a limited, specific vantage point, she acknowledges that the landscape, the animals, and the other people in it possess their own mobile, independent realities.
It's a profound relativism. She refuses to conquer the subject matter. She just observes it, admits her own limitations, and lets the world exist outside of her ego.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive today. What we see across all these incredibly varied texts is that form, diction, and imagery are the primary tools of cultural survival.
Let's take a breath and look at the vast terrain we've covered. We started by looking past the printed page, examining the sacred, living, oral traditions of Native American cultures.
Where poetry functioned as a vital, communal mechanism to align human life with the natural environment.
Right. And then we watched the modernists violently rupture from European traditions, resulting in William Carlos Williams elevating the local slang and the red wheelbarrows of New Jersey.
While Wallace Stevens retreated into the terrifying, isolated sublimity of his own mind against a blank universe.
And from that philosophical tension, we confronted the crushing weight of historical reality. We saw Langston Hughes weaponize everyday diction and the rhythms of jazz to forge a collective racial memory against systemic oppression.
We saw Marianne more meticulously dissect the imperialist fantasies of Jamestown, demanding we look at the marginalized figures forced to tend the shadows of American history.
And finally, we explored the actual architecture of rebellion. We analyzed how Edna St. Vincent Millay used polite traditional sonnets as a Trojan horse for radical female autonomy.
How Hart Crane tried to build a modern mythology out of steel and subways.
And how Elizabeth Bishop's hesitant punctuation and tourist persona decentered the arrogant Western ego.
It is a complex, often contradictory chorus. There is no single American voice. There is only the ongoing argument.
And I want to bring this entirely back to you, the student listening in India right now. As you navigate your own education, your own career, and your own complex national identity, you are participating in this exact same process.
Every single day.
The language you choose to use in a formal setting versus the slang you use with your friends, the regional traditions you proudly uphold, and the outdated conventions you deliberately decide to break. These are not neutral choices.
They are the stylistic choices you use to carve out your identity against the massive backdrop of your country's history.
You are writing your own poetry of survival and self-definition every day.
Which leaves us with a final, vital question to carry forward. We have traced how poetry evolved from a dynamic spoken word around a fire designed to keep a community alive into permanent ink printed on a page to construct a nation's conscience.
But today, we are accelerating into a purely digital algorithmic era.
Right. Our words are no longer spoken into the air or printed on paper. They are typed onto screens, constantly deleted, altered by AI, and consumed as ephemeral, frictionless content.
So if we lose both the sacred communal circle of the oral tradition and the enduring permanence of the printed book, what happens to our collective cultural memory?
In an age where language is instantly disposable, where will the poetry of our true identity find its next home?
That is the kind of question that forces you to rethink every text message and every post you read. The landscape is definitely murkier than ever, but perhaps that just means the next great stanza is waiting to be written by someone listening right now. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the structures around you, keep listening to the complex chorus of your own culture, and we will catch you next time.